I'm Holly Race. I'm the author of Midnight's Twins and A Gathering Midnight, and they are part of a YA urban fantasy trilogy. The third one is coming out next year. It's called A Midnight Dark and Golden. They are loosely based on Arthurian legend, and they are set between this world and the world we go to when we dream, because when we dream, we go into an alternative universe, and if we're killed by our nightmares there, then we die in this world as well. And my twins, Fern and Ollie, they learn that there is an army, a secret army, who protects dreamers from their nightmares, and they kind of become involved in this army and start to realize that there's something out there that is more dangerous than nightmares even.
How about you, Anne? Oh.
And I think you've got the mute button on.
Oh, let's have a look.
Oh, is that better?
Yeah, can hear you now.
Sorry, I was just bemoaning my Wi-Fi troubles. So I'm on mobile very shakily. But yes, unfortunately, I don't have a book like Holly to show off. Proofs are coming out December, so I'm very excited about that. But yes, my book is called Rebel Skies. It's a teen fantasy set in a fantasy version of Meiji Japan. And for those who aren't familiar with Japanese history, Meiji Japan has been called Japan's Industrial Revolution. So like a lot of Asian fantasy, it's not so much ninja and samurai, and more steamships and guns and things like that. But it is a fantasy, so there's also origami monsters and paper magic. And Rebel Skies is basically about a girl named Clara. And yes, her name is significant. It has plot significance before people come at me about that. But Clara is a servant aboard a floating banquet hall when she and her best friend, who are both servants there, are attacked by an origami monster, and in the process, her best friend is injured. So in order to save him, she sort of joins up with a tag team of a crew actually, of sky bounty hunters who hunt these origami monsters. And she goes on a quest to help save her best friend. And in doing so, she learns more about her own abilities to control paper magic and about the world and how everything ties into these strange paper monsters that attack them.
It sounds incredible, I must say. It sounds absolutely, I can't wait. Now, do you want to tell us about this? I've only just started it, so no spoilers. But yeah, introduce yourself and your books.
So yes, books. My name is Kesia Lupo, and I'm the author of We Are Blood and Thunder and We Are Bound by Stars. They are two standalone fantasy adventures for YA readers, both set in the same world but disconnected stories with different characters. So the first book, We Are Blood and Thunder, is about two young women who, one of them lives in a mountaintop city that's been cut off from the rest of the world for about 6 years. And it's been cut off by this magical storm cloud. And she ends up being convicted of the crime of magecraft and escaping into the surrounding city, into the surrounding forest. And there in the forest, she crosses paths with the second character, who is coming home after a long absence, and she is the heir to this city. And their two fates, they don't know it, but are completely intertwined, and it's all about the spell that the city has been under. The second book, We Are Bound by Stars, is set in a Sicilian-inspired island, where again it's a dual narrative, so two characters who are apparently disconnected. Their fates are kind of entangled by, again, another magical spell, to do with mask making and to do with kind of the magic that comes from the earth of this kind of Sicilian type island. it's kind of inspired by my husband's family, which is where my name comes from, Lupo. So it's kind of, yeah, all sort of tied in with that and sort of Venetian mask making and stuff. So yeah, those are my 2 books so far, and my 3rd book is going to be completely different, that is coming out in 23. So keep an eye out for that.
A little bit of time to wait then.
Just a little bit.
I'll have to space them out so
Yeah.
that I'm not waiting too long in between each one. So I suppose the first question to ask you all is, what kind of drew you to writing fantasy stories, rather than anything else like thrillers or anything? I know there's reasons why I, as a reader, am always drawn to the fantasy shelves, and I think I always will be. But it would be interesting from a writer's perspective to know what it is about writing fantasy that kind of drew you to it, or do you think it was just always going to be fantasy that you wrote? Who shall we start with? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I went last time. So. Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually didn't start out writing fantasy. I've always read it, always enjoyed it. You know, I was one of those fantasy nerds during my sort of middle grade years. I read Lord of the Rings twice in one summer holiday, like the whole trilogy, twice. I was that obsessed with it. And you know, knowing that, you know, it's now, is it actually 20 years since that? I just can't. Yeah. So I was the kid that like went every single year for their birthday to the Lord of the Rings movies, Harry Potter movies, like everything. So I've always been a fan, but I did study history at uni, and at the time I thought, oh, this is more serious. This is like, you know, proper literature, is sort of historical fiction, and I should write about that. So my first book that I wrote was historical fiction, but it didn't get representation, didn't get anywhere with it. And so I started just writing for fun and writing what I enjoyed, which happened to be fantasy. And I never would have expected that that would be the thing that sort of got me a publishing deal. But I guess it's just writing what you love and what you love to read. So yeah, for me, it was just that, really.
Yeah, I think I'm only to, I think, like chapter 3, but it's amazing so far. So I'm very glad that you've kind of you diverted to the fantasy from the kind of like historical. How about you, Holly?
Yeah, I mean, I also always read fantasy growing up, and there was kind of never any question in my mind that if I were to try and write an entire book, that it would be fantasy, probably. I think I've also always really loved reading those kind of fantasies where something fantastical is layered on top of the real world, because it was like a promise that there was something more magical and more beautiful that you could escape to, which definitely during my teenage years felt important to be like, maybe just around the corner I'll be able to get into a better life with people who actually like me. So I think one of the reasons why I wanted to set my books the way they're set up is to hopefully offer some readers a little bit of that same feeling of kind of escapism in that respect as well, like maybe their people are waiting just beyond the veil, kind of thing.
I think that's what definitely, as a reader, why I love fantasy, that kind of like, it is the escapism of it. There's something magical about being able to step into a slightly different world. That means I adore it. I mean, most of my shelves are fantasy, I have to admit. How about you, Anne?
I think I'm going to give a very cliche answer of yeah, I was always into fantasy as a kid, and that was basically everything that I read a lot of fantasy, and that was the only thing that I was interested in writing, really. I think it might have stemmed from my aversion of the real world. It's like, as little real world in my books as possible, please. So yeah, I am very jealous of people who write contemporary fantasy, because I tried it a bit, and I found it very, very difficult to sort of get that feeling of the real layered with the fantastical. So everything is fantastical for me. I can't do the real world, which may say a lot about me as a person, because I can't deal with the real world at all.
I'm the same. I'd much rather live in a fantasy world, I think. What part do you think is your favourite kind of element of writing for fantasy? Do you have one? Should we start with Anne? Go back round that way.
Yeah, definitely. This is such a cliche answer, but also the world building is really fascinating to me. But it's a small itty bitty parts of the world building. Example, like if you had magical familiars and you had planes, what kind of, legislation would there be to like let your magical familiars board the planes? Are they counted as pets? Like if you had a postman who could do magic, how would they get that post to you? And it's like the really tiny, like it's almost mundane things, and how the fantastical affects the mundane. It's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I always find those little bits that are kind of hidden in the text really interesting to kind of find and read, because it is those things where you're like, oh, actually that makes sense. I'd have never thought of how that happened, but now that I can like see it written down, it makes total sense. How about you, Holly?
I think there are kind of two elements that I really enjoy. One is the way that you can use fantasy as metaphor for kind of real world issues in a way that doesn't kind of, I suppose, make it feel too depressing, which I'm aware is a bit ridiculous coming from me, and some of the stuff that goes on in my books is pretty depressing. But yeah, I think having that freedom to play with those metaphors is really exciting for me. And also the freedom that the world building gives you. I love the fact that I'll be like, oh, how do I get my character out of this situation? And it's like, oh, well, I created this world, so I'll make up a thing and seed it back through the rest of the book. And like, that's in my power to do, I think, because I work a lot on like crime shows and stuff, where in my other job for TV, and there's lots of kind of like, is this really what would happen? And can we back this up? And do we have to ask the consultants about this? And yeah, it's really freeing to just be like, no, I'll just make up a rule. It's great.
Like, I wish I had that power in real life.
Yeah.
How do I get myself out of this situation? Oh, I can just like imagine myself out of it. That would be a great ability to have.
Definitely. Best superpower ever.
Yeah. That is going to be my new answer to that question. What superpower would you like want to have? Because I think that's an incredible one. And how about you?
I have to say, like, a combination of everything that everyone said so far. The world building is kind of where I start all the time. So I tend to start with a setting, and then I think about what's special about that setting. So with the first book, I guess it was kind of, I grew up in Munich partly, which is surrounded by the Alps and mountains, and it was kind of that kind of mountainous, remote, like, you see these like amazing castles on top of mountains, and like building those real life locations into something fantastical is really fascinating for me. And the bits that tend to start the story and inspire me are like all to do with the setting and like the world. And like I said, with the second book, it was Sicily. But I think also the storytelling is that's a really good point, because I think that's how I write. I tend to be more of a, and then this happened, for my first drafts, or my draft zeros, as I like to say, because I wouldn't share them with anyone. The fact that you can like create magic and create just unreal things to kind of help your characters out, or put obstacles in their way, even more compellingly perhaps, that's something I really enjoy, and something that I'm missing actually writing book 3, which isn't fantasy. So it's really nice to have this perspective now, looking back on those 2 books, and all the way that they were written is just very different from book 3.
What kind of genre is book 3 gonna be, can I ask?
Yes, it is
nosy now, just
yeah,
my version.
it's not announced or anything, but it's going to be a thriller effectively. So, and it is I guess partly contemporary and partly science fiction, but that's all. I'm not really allowed to say any more than that. You know, that whole publishing thing of I have news.
I have news. I can't tell anyone, but I promise I have news. Like, I'd be terrible. Like, I'd just be like, so this has happened all the time. I'd get in so much trouble. It would be like Tom Holland in his interviews for Marvel, where they always have someone with him telling him to like shut up because he's going to spoil the film. That would be me. Would totally be me. So those answers actually lead really well into my next question, which was, how do you go about creating and thinking about kind of like the world building involved in writing a fantasy? Because obviously that can be like political governments, it can be like the setting, magic systems, and it's like, how do you even start to like create that? Because like, I don't think in a million years, if I sat there and tried, I could mesh together a whole world. So it'd be really interesting what kind of like the starting points for each of you are when you think about world building, or if the characters come first. Shall we start with Holly this time?
Sure. So I feel like I'm still slightly stumbling around in the dark on this. When I first started coming up with the world of Anun, which is the dream world in my books, I knew that it was set in the world of dreams, which kind of gives you quite a broad slate, I suppose. Like, you can kind of do anything, right, with your dreams. So my first the first thing I had to do was actually to put some rules on it. Otherwise it would just feel a bit too chaotic, I think, and it wouldn't feel like a cohesive world. So I think putting those parameters in place really helped me figure out what I was doing with it, and what kind of palette I wanted to work with, I suppose. And because a lot of it is based on Arthurian legends, I did a lot of research into kind of Welsh mythology and Gaelic languages and old Welsh languages, and kind of went from there. And I did originally have a lot of detail that I'd worked out before I put pen to paper, and actually it didn't work for me at all. I didn't really use very much of it because I didn't know what my story was at that point. So I think there was a temptation to kind of try and force all of this information that I'd spent years figuring out onto the paper. I was like, but this isn't necessary for the story that you're trying to tell. So for A Gathering Midnight, I ended up kind of trusting that I'd figure out how to deal with the world building elements as I went along. So I had, because I plot on post-it notes, and I kind of put things in my post-it notes like, big monster here that we haven't seen before, and was like, I don't know what the monster is, and kind of wrote my draft zero like Hes, and when I got to that point I'd be like, oh, I have an idea for a monster, excellent, and just kind of trusted that it would come to me as I wrote, and that anything that didn't I could fix in draft 0.5 and first draft kind of thing.
Oh, I like that it kind of evolved with the story, and like you have to put rules in place, because I think that would be where I fell down to start with, because I'd be like, oh my god, I can do all of these things, and the world would be so like crazy that like it wouldn't work at all. How about you, Kez?
I mean, that exactly what you just said. I threw everything at it, literally, at the beginning. I mean, the way that I started writing this book was a long time ago. I just started working as an assistant at a big 5 publisher, so it was at Pan Macmillan, and I was working a lot on like the tour list, which was like science fiction, fantasy and horror, So I was just reading all of this stuff, and I think like just absorbing like so much of the kind of tropes in a good way, if that makes sense, of fantasy. And I think that all just kind of got regurgitated in these early stages of writing it. So I had this whole notebook just full of like names of the gods and like types of magic that people could have. And I decided early on that it was all going to be like around color, so different colors of magic would do different things, and they would kind of be like government departments in a way. Like they would be running, people who had magic would be running the country, everyone else would just be, you know, whatever, living in it. So kind of ideas about the world came, like the main ideas about the world came really early, but the detail was like far too much. Exactly like Polly, like I just had like so much detail. And you know, when I wrote the first draft, it was just a mess of like, you know, oh, and this cool thing, and also this cool thing, and like it didn't really have a proper story. So I think one of the big things about world building is, yes, put everything on the page, like go for it, but then just realize that you're going to have to lose a lot of it to make the story actually streamlined and exciting, especially for YA. You can get away with a lot in adult fantasy, but when you've got to keep it to around like less than, let's say, 100,000 words, that's tough to have all of this detail. So yeah, that was kind of my process. And I think that actually that early stage of like just getting everything down is really helpful. It's just not something you can actually keep a lot further along down the line.
How does that feel? Because I think that would be like really emotional, having like created this really like in-depth kind of detailed world and then having to leave bits out for the kind of story, or is this fact that you've kind of, it makes the story flow better, mean that it's not as emotional as maybe it would be?
I mean, for me, maybe this is because through this process I became an editor in my day job.
Yeah,
I actually was quite ruthless and not emotional about the early stuff that I wrote, because I felt like I could look at it with a publisher's point of view and just be like, nah, this isn't what readers want. In my head, it's all still there as well. Like, it's not like all of that is gone. It's just like you've got the, you know, the thing that's out there and that other people share, and then you have your own kind of at the back of your mind, your own sort of additional stuff, and it's always going to be there. But yeah, I know what you mean. I can see it being emotional, especially if you're not used to the idea of like, I have to write for readers and for a business, and I'm just, you know, I'm used to writing for myself. Like that could be really tough.
Yeah. Not that I am an emotional person, but I think I'd find that very emotional, being like, I'd probably be one of those people that would then be like, oh, but also I did plan for this nugget of information to be there. I'd almost need like a separate, like, I'd have to do a Tolkien and do like a book of just like lore based on wherever I'd created, I think, because I just don't know if I'd be able to let it all go.
If you're lucky and you're writing a series, then sometimes you get to put all the stuff that you took out of book one into book two. I had to remove like so many chapters from my book one for my editor, and one of the chapters had some stuff that I was like, oh, but I really want people to understand this. And then in book two came along, I was like, it's the perfect place for it. And then it meant that I saved myself so much time, because that was like 2,500 words that I didn't have to write. Copy and paste, done, sorted.
I love that. How about you, Anne?
Yeah, I think like Holly and Kez, I also end up with way too much like world building and things that I just can't fit on into a book. I like to think of it as like painting. You start off with a sketch and then you slowly color in things. So in the case of Rebel Skies, the base sketch was actual Meiji Japan, and then through research deciding what to take out and what to leave in, and how closely it would be to, you know, real history, and then layering on the fantasy colors after that. So like I did a lot of research about what kind of guns did they have during Meiji Japan, and you know, how fast were their steam trains, And it led me down this will probably be a familiar story, but it led me down a research hole of looking at when dairy farming was introduced into Japan. And there's nothing about dairy farming in my book at all. But I now have in the back of my head the knowledge that one of the sky cities is the only place you can get cheese in Rebel Skies. And that doesn't that's not a plot point, and it doesn't appear all in the books, but I just know it in the back of my head.
I love that. I feel like you should all do like a little blog and like every so often just put out like random just fun bits of information that you couldn't fit in the books. I'd read it. I'd love that. So another question is, I personally love a morally grey character. Now, I know some people don't. I know some people like kind of not all light or all dark, but you know, like more extreme versions of characters. What do you prefer writing and what do you prefer reading when you're kind of reading fantasy as well? So shall we start with Anne? We'll go back round that way.
Yeah, that's a really good question. When it comes to reading, I don't mind at all, whether they're like goody two shoes or they're morally grey. If it fits the book, you know, it's fine for me. So reading wise, I can go either way. Writing wise, I don't know if I'd call them morally grey so much as being people, and people can be awful as well as great at the same time. So with Rebel Skies, and what I'm a bit afraid of is that there are some awful people in Rebel Skies who are, but they do awful things, but you kind of see their point, kind of like, oh well, you killed all these people, but you know they had it coming. So I do like characters who are complex in that, you know, it's not so much that they're good or bad or grey, but they have a thing that they want and they go for it if they have to.
Yeah, I love that. I think my reason for loving kind of like the morally grey, more complex characters is they feel a lot more real. Like I could never imagine anybody like being good all the time. Like I just can't imagine it. So I think I just find kind of like morally grey people very relatable. Not that I'd ever murder anyone or anything like that, but you know what I mean? Like tell a little white lie or something is more realistic than kind of your all good character, I think. How about you, Holly?
Yeah, like Anne, I'm happy to kind of read any and all characters on that kind of moral spectrum, but I definitely prefer writing grounded, real, relatable characters, which I think inevitably means morally grey, I'd say. I remember when I was starting to write Fern, I think it was maybe when Captain America came out, and like I love a Marvel film as much as the next person, but there's like a point where Captain America's just got his powers and like the person who gave his powers is dying and kind of puts his hand in his heart as if to say, you know, don't lose your goodness. And I really wanted Captain America to like go on a spree and like do all the shit to his bullies that they did to him and like get it out of his system. And he didn't. And I was a bit like, oh, that's a bit boring. It's a bit bland. So with Fern, I definitely wanted her as she kind of discovers who she is, to maybe have a moment where she's like, yeah, I've been treated really badly and I'm going to revisit that on the people who treated me badly. And kind of have to reckon with that afterwards as well, because I think then that gives you lots of interesting emotions to explore.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, I agree with the Captain America thing. He's always just been too good.
It's very nice to look at, but yeah.
Yeah,
well,
nice to look at, but like boring to be around, I would think. Like just you wouldn't want to go for a drink with Captain America, would you? I don't think.
Good point. No, not really.
Be a bit boring. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I love reading morally grey and frankly evil characters. I've always been that kind of a reader, so that is slightly reflected in my books. But actually, so far, like, I guess, not to give too much away, but Constance is definitely the most morally grey character of the 4 main characters that I have, and I did find her the most fun to write. And I have to say, like, you know, I don't know if you guys feel like this, but the point at which I wrote these books is very reflective of the point I was in my life. So Lena, who's the sort of good quote unquote character in We Are Blood and Thunder, is like the young version of myself who started writing that book, like quite idealistic, quite ambitious, but sweet ultimately. You know, like quite, I would say now, quite anodyne as a character compared to Constance, who developed later on during the editorial process, actually, as a second main voice, who is much more complex and has a lot more kind of going on under the surface. Yeah, and then in the second book, it was kind of like they're both a bit more morally grey, like they're kind of a balance of the two. But I always think that, yeah, like everyone said, it's just unrealistic to have a completely good character. That's the only thing that I really don't like reading or writing, as a completely good character, because it's just like, you know, any real person is going to flip at some point. You know, they're not going to just do the right thing, or at least you've got to show that they're like under pressure. But yeah, it's really interesting to think about how those characters developed and at what time and why, and you know, yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah, I find characters so interesting, kind of trying, as a reader, figuring out their kind of motivations and things. And I think nobody's motivations are all good all the time, despite the kind of effect it has on them. Because I mean, being good all the time would not always benefit you, and I feel like that should come across if it's an all good character. So now we have some book club questions. So they are all questions that have been written by my YA book club in store. There's some very good ones, but we'll start off with maybe not an easy one, actually. Who's your favourite author to read? Should we go back round that way again?
Which way is that? Sorry.
Oh yeah. See, I did this the other day. I was pointing and then I realised that like pointing doesn't help you guys because you can't see where you are on my screen. We'll start with you, Kez.
Kez is good.
I'm going to start with Kez.
Yeah, let's go with that. No, I do actually go by Kez, so that's fine.
Oh, okay. That's easier. I practiced beforehand. I did.
That's very sweet. This is literally like the hardest question to answer for me. I cannot say who's my favorite author to read. I mean, the ones that spring to mind are kind of like golden oldies that I've loved forever, like Stephen King. You know, I love reading horror, so there's lots in that genre that I would read. In terms of fantasy, I'm trying to think, kind of who have I got on my my reading pile. Yeah, I guess I used to be like a huge fan of like Philip Pullman and you know, all of that kind of classic fantasy, but yeah, I don't know, I'm kind of drawing a blank right now. Oh, I know, Brandon Sanderson as well. He was one of my favorites. I think his world building is like second to none. But yeah, sorry, I'm so, this is always the question that stumps me, because I'm just like, I've read so many books, but as soon as someone asks me like, what have you read, I'm just like, I don't know, nothing.
I'm exactly the same, but I do have a whole shelf of Brandon Sanderson books. They like, again, I think it is the world building in those that like always just like capture my attention. So that's a very good choice. I agree with you. How about you, Holly?
Yeah, this is an evil question. It's not helped by the fact that I'm actually a really fickle reader. I'm not sure I have a favorite author. I have favorites depending on my mood. So I also really loved Philip Pullman growing up. H.G. Wells is another one I really like his books. Then depending on what mood I'm in, like I will always devour Laura Purcell kind of gothic story. So many YAs, just looking at my YA shelf, like Bex Hogan, Kat Ellis, Jennifer Donnelly. Yeah, too many. I'm just gonna be here for the rest of the hour listing names, so I'm gonna stop.
I knew it was an evil question when I asked it. When I saw that they'd wrote it, I was like, oh, because it's my most feared question. Whenever anybody asks me, I'm like, I don't know any authors.
Yeah. There is nothing in my head.
Nothing in my head at all. How about you, Am?
Yeah, this is a very, very evil question. I think my answer will probably change depending on the weather and what I've eaten and what color I'm wearing. But like I do like classic Japanese literature, so Natsume Soseki is probably the cliche answer, and also Yukio Mishima. If you for fantasy, yeah, same. Also like some golden. Is it? But I want to say oldies. They're not oldies, but golden classics like Philip Pullman, Jonathan Stroud. Lately, I really like Liz Lim, and also Frances Hardinge is always a great read. I read Deep Light quite recently, and Face Like Glass, and she always amazes and surprises me with how she puts together such different worlds each time.
Yeah, I do find that, like with authors, it always amazes me when they can like do one book in one world and then the next book it's something completely different, and I'm like, how can you even have that many thoughts? And I'd struggle to think of one world, never mind like some people have 5, and I'm like, how do you like, and then they write sequels in different orders, and I'm like, would you not get I don't understand. You're all much cleverer than me, because that would break me if I tried. The next question was, what's the hardest part about writing a book? Shall we start with Anne this time?
Oh, all of it. All of it is difficult. Yeah, that's no. But seriously, I think probably the most difficult part is for me getting characters to do things that I want them to do, instead of going off on tangents about cheese and where they can get the only place that they can get cheese in the Empire. So yeah, I've struggled many times to get a character from A to B without them, you know, running off on some weird errand.
But I love that. Honestly, I need you to write a blog with all these like cheese related like these nuggets of information that are in your head, because like I love that you focused in on that and that you know exactly where in the Empire you can get the cheese. I love it. How about you, Kez?
Yeah, I think for me it's the first draft or draft 0. The agonizingly terrible first draft that you're like, even as you're writing it, you're just like, I'm cringing because I have to send this to my editor. That's the thing about being contracted. Like before, it was like, okay, this is kind of cringe, but whatever, like I'm just going to be the one reading it. But now when you've got deadlines and you're like, I'm going to have to send my draft 0 to my editor, it is excruciating. And like, I'm so apologetic in my email as well. I'm just like, I'm so sorry for sending you this bag of crap. It is terrible. I hope you can somehow still like me after finishing it. Honestly. And they're always so short as well. Like my first drafts are always like, you know, 30,000, 35,000 words, and I've got to get it up to like 70, and I just can't see how it's ever going to happen. I'm just like, what am I doing? And then it is actually like, now I've done it twice effectively, I kind of know that it's part of the process and it's okay. And it's just like, you just have to get through it. You just have to accept that it's going to be painful. And once I get on to the second draft and third draft, I'm like, okay, this is a book. It will be a book. I can see where it's going. But yeah, I would say that first draft, yeah, painful.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that I've asked that question to have the first draft as their kind of like pet peeve. Like they're like, it's just everything that's in here on a piece of paper and it doesn't really make sense to me, never mind anyone that reads it. So I think that that's a common like, no, don't like that bit. How about you, Holly?
For me, kind of similar. It's probably the second draft. So I love the plotting process, and then my draft zeros I can usually write relatively quickly because I know that I'm a big fan of the shitty first draft, and so I just get the words down, just fill the pages, fill the blank pages, and I know I'm quite good at accepting at that point that it is going to be very, very bad indeed. It's the next stage that I hate because it's not going to be great at that next stage either. It's going to be better, like things are going to be roughly in the right place and characters are going to be doing stuff that's vaguely logical instead of just like, oh, and then they do a thing. But it's still not really something that I would like to read, really. So that bit is kind of the bit that I always really dread, right up until the maybe third draft where you're sort of tinkering and suddenly something clicks. You're like, oh, I don't hate this anymore. Hooray! Maybe I'm not an awful writer.
Like, I can't imagine having to like spend so much time going through things because I write text messages and look back at them and don't know what I was trying to say, so I can't imagine going back through like drafts and trying to figure out what I was trying to put where. It's a skill I'd love to have but definitely do not possess at all. The next question, which is one that I'm very interested to know the answer to, is how do you think of the names for your characters? Because like I've had pets ever since I can remember it, and that's a hard process, naming pets. And like you can have like 10-15 characters, or you can have like with little side ones and they've all got names and like, and they're genius names. It's not like it's Fred or Stu. So I'd really be interested how like each of you come up with names. Should we start with Holly first this time?
I spend far too much time figuring out the names for my characters, way more time than it really warrants. It depends on the character, I think, for me, in terms of their background, their ethnicity, you know, where they've grown up, just all stuff like that. And then sometimes it's depending if they're quite a significant character, it will be related to their story arc as well a little bit. And I'll try and kind of draw on folklore and things like that to help me. I did have in an early draft, so it was quite important to me that, for reasons that I won't go into, that Fern and Ollie had names that started with F and O and that their surname was King. And originally Fern was going to be called Faye because I really like the name Faye. And it took me a good like 50,000 words before I realized the issue with calling my character Faye King. I was like, probably need to change that.
I love that.
Yeah, so then she became Fern quite late in the day.
I love that, because as she was explaining it, it didn't click in my head either. It wasn't until you emphasized it that my brain went, oh,
yeah.
I did exactly the same thing, I think, in that situation. How about you, Anne?
I got very, very excited when you asked this question, because names are something I love to spend lots of time on. And in the case of Rebel Skies, almost everyone has a significant name. And because it's Japanese inspired fantasy, I know, so this is another thing that will never come out in the book proper, but I also know the kanji for each of their names. So the main character, Clara, has a significant name, and the kanji in her name has plot significance that will probably never ever be explained. But also, because it's slightly based on Meiji Japan, I looked into census data from Meiji Japan, just so that nobody had like a really, really outrageously modern name apart from Clara. So all the names are also historically accurate. And then after finding names that are historically accurate, I thought I had to look into the kanji, and oh, well, does this person want the kanji for fire in their name? They're not a really fiery person. So then that took me down another rabbit hole of research. But in the end, yeah, everyone has a historic name, and the kanji is significant, which nobody will ever know unless they read kanji, and that makes me sad. But
Anne, can I be really ignorant and ask what a kanji is?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the kanji is the Chinese characters that make up people's. Oh, it's one of the many, many writing systems in Japan. There's 3 quote unquote alphabets. They're not really alphabets, but there's hiragana, katakana, and then kanji. And kanji is basically Chinese writing.
Thank you. Sorry. It was just really fascinating. I was like, I don't feel like I'm fully understanding.
No, thank you for asking, because I tend to go off on a tangent thinking, oh yeah, everybody knows what kanji is, and yeah, I sort of get carried away and forget. Yeah.
And Kez.
Yes, that was really fascinating, and I
really, know, that's why I just
like, oh my gosh,
paused after it. I was like, that's so interesting, because it's something I wouldn't pick up on when I was kind of reading, like how significant names are. I think sometimes when I read names, I just, oh, that's the character's name, and I don't really think more into it as a reader. So that's given me something else to look into like books I read now, which is very exciting for me. So thank you for that.
So yeah, I was not that elaborate. I think honestly, a lot of it is just like names that I like. The one exception, or the 2 exceptions, I guess, Constance, I did think was a reflection of her character, because in this society in Duke's Forest, which is the mountaintop city in book 1, lots of people have virtue names, and I decided Constance was good for her because that, I don't know, it kind of comes out in the plot, let's just say, but I don't want to give anything away. And in the second book, the name Livio was actually the name, he's the heir to the Contessa who rules the island. And that is the name of my grandmother's first husband, who was an Italian Conte. And I always wanted to use that name somehow, Livio, and this just seemed like the perfect opportunity to plunder my own family history. So there's a bit of that. And then Beatrice, I kind of chose because every single other, because like it's Sicilian inspired and there's kind of a French Norman influence in Sicily. And secondly, because basically every other name in the book is Italianate, and I wanted her to stand out and like to feel different, and I felt like that was a good way of signaling that she didn't feel like she was part of this island culture. So yeah, I think that it's a mixture of just like, oh, that's a cool name, let's just use that one, And then sometimes, like occasionally, there is a little bit more thought that goes into it for me. But yeah, I love the idea of the kanji and like having the like dual meaning and like really going into their character. So yeah, that's really fascinating, and I definitely in future books, I think it's something that I do want to put more thought into as well, because I think it's really cool to like look up the meaning of a name and see how that, and when I've done that, it's incredibly satisfying. Like with Constance, I'm just like, yes, that is the exact right name for her, and I'm like so satisfied that it sort of plays out in her character. So yeah, I'm inspired, Anne, thank you.
I honestly feel like I'm gonna have to like run to my bookshelves after this thing and just like start looking through books I've read with the different names and see if I can like find a deeper meaning in any of them, because I think that's a really I think names are something that sometimes you just kind of go, oh well, my name's Charlie, it's just a like it's a name, I don't place any kind of like significance on it. So when I'm reading, I've never really thought much about the names other than that's a badass name, maybe. But yeah, so that's really interesting. I'm really glad that they asked that question and that I got to ask you guys it, because that's incredible. If you could live in any book world, which would it be? This can be any book, so it could be a children's book, adult's book, YA. I don't know if I'd choose to live in any of them because I don't think I'd last long in any of them, because I'm far too clumsy. How about you, Kez?
I mean, realistically, yeah, same. I mean, ridiculous. Oh my god, I am just the kind of person who, whatever I'm reading at the time, I will fully imagine myself in that world. And as a child, I would just, like envisage myself as a character in Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, or the his Dark Materials trilogy. Like, I honestly, that is what I do. So it's kind of just, I want to have the power. Like, if I could choose a power, it'd be the power to actually enter the world of the book I was reading, whatever it was, and stay safe and not die. But
yeah, that would be a key bit for me, because I would definitely end up no, it would not end well. I don't even think I'd make it halfway down a page before something terrible happens. I think that's why when I was a kid I really liked Inkheart, because there was that idea of kind of like traveling into the world in the book, and I like to pretend I'm in a lot of worlds, but I know realistically if you put me in Lord of the Rings or anything, I would I wouldn't be able to ride a horse properly. There's no way I could climb mountains or, fight. I can barely walk in a straight line sometimes without up. So me with a bow and arrow, as much as I like to think that I'd be the badass assassin type of character, it definitely wouldn't happen.
No, and I think because that was kind of a trick answer, if I had to go for one big fantasy world, I'd choose The Wizard of Earthsea. I love that series so much, and that so captured my imagination as a teenager. But yeah, that kind of world would be kind of my dream, being able to, as long as I was able to do magic and say the words that controlled the sea and everything, would be super cool.
Yeah, I feel like I want the power to travel to book worlds, but also gain the talents of people within those worlds, because otherwise I'd travel there and it would be pointless because I'd be there 5 minutes. And it would all end in tears. How about you, Holly?
Yeah, I wouldn't last very long in any fantasy world, so I think I'm going to flake out of the fantasy genre. Sorry. I think either the very end of Watership Down, I think I would do really well as a rabbit on a really nice, remote, secluded hill, just eating grass with my mates. That would be fine. I'd be up for that. Or Jane Austen's world.
I don't think I'd last well then either.
I'd be the one that like got sick of something and ended up the rest of their life just coughing delicately into a handkerchief.
Yeah.
No, now you've said that. That's exactly what
I'd be the one that kind
Actually,
of like, I'd be like stuck in the corner with everyone just looking at me full of pity every so often with my multiple handkerchiefs, and yeah, I don't think I'd do well there either. And I definitely embarrassed myself.
Not married yet, and we've lost hope in her.
Yeah, that would be me. How about you, Anne?
Yeah, I also have a list of worlds that I would not like to be in because I'd probably die very quickly in them. I think if I had to give an answer, it would probably be His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, because I would also probably die in that world, but at least I would have a demon for however long it took before I died horribly.
The best thing is, I feel like if I went to any of these like worlds, it would be the most boring way of dying as well. Like I'd trip over something and fall off a cliff while I was trying to hide from someone, or like land on a spear. Like it wouldn't be anything like, it wouldn't be like a heroic fought to the end kind of situation. It would be, oh, she's tripped over a branch and fallen off the cliff. Isn't that sad? And their last question was, if you could be any character in any book in the entire world, what character do you think you'd be? It could be a type of character, or it could be like a certain character. Apparently I can't say S's today. Who shall we start with first? Has anybody got an idea for the answer? That's a no. It's like, no, don't pick me first.
I mean, honestly, any kind of wizard, magician, mage, like I would just love, you know, whatever world it was in, I would just love to be able to do magic. I think that would be the coolest thing. But again, kind of a cop-out answer, but sorry. It's true.
No, like, I think if it was me, it would either be some kind of magician, magic person, or I've always liked the idea of being like a really cool assassin with like little, just loads of knives. Which in the real world, I'd like cut my fingers on, and you know, it would be terrible. I'd like injure myself more than anybody else. But yeah, I think when I like, since I've been a kid, the idea of being like this mysterious, sneaky, not even like the killing people, just like the actions and stuff, like looks quite badass kind of scenario. I think, yeah, which is probably a cop-out answer too, but I think anything that's like magical or just really kind of cool and looks badass is the kind of character I would be, which is as far away from who I am as a person in real life as possible, because I'm the clumsiest, like loudest, least sneaky person you could ever meet. So, you know, I suppose opposites attract. So I would like to be the complete opposite of how I am in this world. How about you, Holly?
I just say I feel like we're getting a really interesting picture of you, Charlie. When you're like, earlier you're like, I mean, obviously I never murder anyone, and now you want to be an assassin. It's kind of all building up here.
Never murder anyone in the real world, but that doesn't mean that the thoughts don't come into the back of my head sometimes. I've been reading too many of Kat's books, you see. I've been reading many horrors and watching too many true crime documentaries lately, so it's obviously like filtering into the back of my head.
I feel like I'm answering this incorrectly, but actually I think I would like to be like the sassy best friend, because they're usually quite witty, but they don't have all of the responsibility that the main character does. So they can just be from the side. They're like, go you, you're great. I'm going to stay over here. I think
I'm going to be safe over here and
yeah.
occasionally deliver a really cool one-liner.
Exactly.
I like that answer. I really like that answer. Anne, what about you?
Yeah, I think anything that is not likely to die is the best. So any sort of god or magical, powerful wizard would be really good. In my book, in Rebel Skies, there's a group of people who can use paper magic, and all they have to do is think, and they can make giant paper birds and like paper swords, and that are actually sharp enough to cut people and things like that. So maybe I would like to be able to use paper magic, because I've tried origami and I can make cranes and nothing else. So if I had that power, I could finally make a paper rabbit or something different.
I like that. I'm rubbish at anything kind of like folding like that. I don't know why. I don't think I've ever successfully made a crane. I have tried, but it's never worked. I've tried with napkins as well. No, it's not a talent I possess. So that would be a good magical skill, actually.
You'll get sick of cranes after a while. I've been tired of cranes. I can only make cranes, and that's it.
It's better than nothing. So that is all of the questions for today. So thank you for answering them all. You've all been incredible. Do you all want to go around and just let people know where they can find you? I will link it all in the kind of descriptions and things, but you know, might as well tell everyone while they're here. What about you guys? Start with you, and then we'll go Holly and Anne.
Yep, you can find me on Twitter at Kesia Lupo, and on Instagram at Kesia Lupo author, I think.
That does sound familiar, but I will double check.
Thank you. I always forget that handle.
On to you, Holly.
So I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Holly_race, and I'm on Twitter at Ekarillo, which is my name spelled backwards. As I explained in the other panel, thought it was clever at the time. It's just annoying now. That's
I'm on TikTok too. I forgot.
What's your TikTok?
At Kesia Lupo, I think. I really need to memorize these, don't I? But yeah, I'm pretty sure it's at Kesia Lupo. And I haven't posted anything of myself yet because I'm too shy. So please come and follow me and give me encouragement.
And you, Anne?
I'm available only on Twitter at Sei Lin 1. I've only got Twitter and not Instagram or TikTok or anything, because if I have too much social media, I explode. I can't